Falling for Sydney, written by Heather B. Moore, narrated by Exie Sands. 1. There you are, sweetie, Olivia crooned as Sydney Morley stepped into the bridal shop. Sydney tipped up her cheek as the saleswoman air-kissed her. I'm so sorry I'm late, Sydney said, putting on a smile and hoping it would mask the knot that had formed in her stomach. She was never late, and she'd never felt so disorganized, but ever since she had returned from her all-girls vacation in Maui with her two best friends, June and Maria, something had felt off with Rian. As in Rian Stevenson, her fiancé, the man she was marrying in 2 weeks. It was Thursday now, and Sydney had taken today and tomorrow off work to get all the loose ends tied up for the wedding. You are just fine, Olivia continued in her sing-song voice as if she was speaking to a 3-year-old instead of 26-year-old Sydney. We had a cancellation, so this ended up being perfect. Perfect. Sydney hated the word. She'd heard it throughout her life as people told her she was perfect. Perfect hair, perfect teeth, perfect body. What was so wrong with taking care of herself? And then there was Rian, who was model gorgeous and didn't seem to mind the constant compliments about his appearance. Rian. Perfect couple. The knot in her stomach tightened, making her feel like she'd skipped a couple of meals, when, in fact, she'd had her usual homemade protein shake and whole wheat bagel this morning. Olivia pulled back the curtain separating the front of the bridal store from the dressing rooms. There, on a mannequin in the center of the room, was Sydney's wedding gown. It had cost a pretty penny, but Sydney knew as soon as she saw it that this was the dress for her. The alterations she requested make it even more beautiful, Olivia said as she swept toward the mannequin. She pointed to the capped butterfly sleeves and the beading at the hem that Sydney had requested. I love it, Sydney said, and it was the truth. It was a dream dress for a dream wedding with a dream man. So how did she justify sitting outside of Rian's condo that morning for 30 minutes, watching the car that was in his numbered space? She knew he was home. At least he had been when she'd left the night before, around 11 p.m. He'd seemed anxious to send her home, told her he had some real estate bids to put together. The ironic thing was that he'd been incredibly busy since Sydney's return from her vacation, pretty much reversing their roles. If anyone was begging for more time together, it was usually Rian. Sydney had recently been promoted to vice president of operations at a small software firm, which had inundated her with work over the past 6 months. She was thrilled with the extra pay, but she'd put almost everything she loved, except for Rian, on the back burner. She'd stopped riding horses at the local arena, and she'd foregone weekend Netflix binges in favor of catching up on more work, so she'd have evenings free with Rian. A sad stack of bestsellers sat gathering dust on her nightstand, and she'd even cut down her hour-long workouts to 30 minutes. She hoped things would slow down soon, but if they didn't, she might have to consider a job change. When Sydney had left Rian's condo the night before, his car had been parked in his slot. Now there was a red truck, not Rian's. Well, let's see how it looks. Olivia's voice cut through Sydney's thoughts. Yes, of course, Sydney said. Olivia closed the curtain to the massive dressing room and began to take the dress off the mannequin. Sydney tucked her phone into her purse after glancing at it again and checking to see that the sound was turned up. She'd texted Rian twice this morning. And no reply yet. She slipped out of her thigh-length baby doll dress, and Olivia helped her into the wedding dress, one limb at a time. Wait, Olivia said, producing a rhinestone hair clip. Don't look in the mirrors yet. Deftly, Olivia swept Sydney's long blonde hair into a twist, clipped it, and then said, All right, turn around. Sydney slowly turned and gazed at her full-length reflection in the mirror. The creamy ivory of the silk fabric seemed to glow beneath the lights, and the shape of the dress molded to her body. The sleeves and the extra beading had been the right choice. You're absolutely gorgeous, sweetie, Olivia said in a breathless voice. Thank you, Sydney murmured. But even now, staring at her future self, a bride, she couldn't tamp down the knot in her stomach that was turning into all-out panic. Why wasn't Rian texting her back? Whose car was in his parking space? Both she and Ryan had discussed their past relationships after their first few dates. Although to some, it might seem that their relationship had progressed quickly, engaged within 3 months of their first date, Sydney had been ready to settle down. She was 26 and Ryan a year older. Olivia was snapping photos with her cell phone, which snapped Sydney from her thoughts. "Oh, wait," she said, then amended. "Never mind. You can take some pictures. Send them to me." "We won't post anything on our website until after the wedding," Olivia assured her. "We don't want the groom to get a sneak peek," she laughed. Sydney gave a fake smile. Her thoughts turned back to Ryan as she remembered how he'd stayed in his shirt and tie last night, even though they'd had a casual late dinner at his condo. Ryan was a slim man, obsessed with mountain biking, and he usually preferred to stay in his comfortable clothing over slacks and a dress shirt. He was almost as much a health nut as she was, which suited both of them well during their shared meals. But Ryan's blue eyes hadn't been as doting as usual. His smile hadn't felt as genuine, and several times Sydney had to repeat herself. As Sydney stepped out of her wedding dress, she knew she could no longer wait to hear from Ryan. She was going to go back over to his condo right then and knock on his door. She'd use her key if she had to. Sydney had barely thanked Olivia before she was out the door and calling her best friends. First, she sent them an SOS text, and seconds later, they were on a conference call. Bluetooth in place, Sydney started to drive while pouring out her entire sob story to June and Maria. June was the more quiet and serious of the three, so Sydney was surprised when June broke in first. "I'm coming down," she said. "Portland isn't exactly next door to Santa Rosa," Sydney protested. "I'm coming too," Maria added, her usual positive tone, quiet as well. "It's probably all nothing, but I want to be there for you, whatever happens." "You guys are awesome," Sydney said, "but really, I think I have cold feet or something." June snorted. "You never get cold feet about anything, Sydney. You're the most decisive woman I know." "Yeah," Sydney said as Ryan's condo complex came into view. "I'm going in now." She took a deep breath. "Wish me luck." Moments later, her resolve reinforced by her friends, she knocked on Ryan's door. The red truck was still in the parking spot, and there was no sign of Ryan's car. Heart hammering, Sydney waited at the door, but no one answered. So, finally, she used her key to unlock it. As she went to turn the knob, the door swung open. A man stood there, a towel wrapped around his waist and his dark hair wet and dripping. He'd obviously just been showering, and by the look in his stormy gray eyes, he was not happy. 2. "Who are you?" Sydney asked the man who towered over her and had a sculpted chest and arms. What was he, a weightlifter? And why was he in Ryan's apartment? Sydney knew all his friends. "Who are you?" the man asked, acting equally frustrated. And then, like a light switch had been touched, the storm in his eyes cleared and went calm. "Sydney?" She took a step back. "Do I know you? Are you one of Ryan's friends?" She certainly hoped so, while at the same time reasoning with herself that a burglar probably wouldn't help himself to a shower. Um, he mumbled, cinching the towel a bit tighter at his waist. Sydney kept her gaze firmly focused on his face. He was a good-looking man, not in the model way Ryan was, but more of rugged way. Flaws mixed with charm. Not that he'd been charming or anything. "I'm Ryan's brother," the man said. He stuck out his hand toward her. "Jacob. Or Jake's fine." "Jake." Sydney narrowed her eyes. "Ryan doesn't have a brother." Ryan had a younger sister, and that was it. His parents had died years before, and his sister wouldn't be able to come to the wedding because she was about 8 months pregnant and lived on the East Coast. Jake lowered his hand when Sydney made no move to shake it. "Interesting," he said, leaning against the doorframe, which only brought him a touch closer to Sydney. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she was sure her friends were dying for an update, or maybe Ryan had finally texted her back. But before she could check, Jake said, "So, which story is Ryan going with this time? The whole family died in a car crash, leaving him an orphan, or estranged from my millionaire father and his new wife, or adopted by an older couple who left everything to me in their will?" Another storm was building in those intense gray eyes. Sydney took a step back, putting more space between them. "None of those stories." He has a younger sister who lives on the East Coast, and his parents passed away a couple of years ago. I think you have the wrong Ryan, sir." Jake gazed at her for a moment, and it looked like he might smile. Instead, he said, "Come in. I'll find some proof. That is, if my being here at his place isn't enough proof." "I'm fine out here," Sydney said. "All right," Jake said. Give me a minute to get dressed." Sydney waited on the landing while Jake disappeared inside. She sent another text to Ryan. "Knocked on your door, and some guy named Jake answered. Claims he's your half-brother." Even as she pressed send, she was coming up with all kinds of scenarios as to why Ryan hadn't mentioned Jake. That is, if Jake really was a brother. Maybe Ryan didn't consider him family? Maybe there had been a falling out between them. And what was going on with Jake claiming that Ryan had multiple stories he told people? "Haven't been able to get a hold of him, have you?" a voice said. Sydney looked up. Yeah, Jake was a great-looking guy. Now, dressed in faded jeans and a fitted t-shirt, Jake looked much more presentable. His hair was drier, although he was still barefoot. He joined Sydney on the landing. "Here," he said, holding out his phone after scrolling through it. "You can read our recent text messages. You should start at the beginning." The first text message was dated about a week before, and the communication looked like several interchanges per day over the week. Ryan, "I'm out of money. Can you do a transfer?" Jake, "What about that real estate job you told Mom about?" Ryan, "I was fired, but I'm still supposed to get a commission coming. Might be a few weeks, so." Jake, "I'm assuming you already asked Dad and he said no." Ryan, "Correct. It's important or I wouldn't ask." Jake, "You know I'd never let you starve, but you're in tons of debt already." Ryan, "Yeah, but that will change soon. I'm getting married." Jake, "What?" Ryan, "She's got a great job, makes good money, and I really like this one." Jake, "Don't do this again, Ryan." Ryan, "Don't worry, she's my age, LOL." Jake, "Not funny." Ryan, "Well, I need money for our honeymoon. After that, I won't ask for another dime. We'll be joint account owners, and I can pay the family back soon." Jake, "Don't do this, Ryan. Just come home. Work at the ranch and pay down your debt. Start over with a clean slate." Sydney looked up at Jake. She couldn't read anymore. Not yet. "Tell me what's going on," she said, feeling sick to her stomach now. "Is our engagement a sham?" Jake ran his hand along his jaw. "Ryan's been married 5 times. He marries wealthy women, then dumps them after he gets a hold of their bank accounts. After the last one, he faced legal charges, and my parents bailed him out. The courts couldn't prove malicious intent, so Ryan got off. Moved here, finally got a regular job, and we were all hoping he'd learned his lesson." Jake waved a hand towards Sydney. She could only stare at him, dumbfounded. "I'm sorry to be the one to bring you bad news," he continued. "But when you read the rest of the text, you'll see that you aren't like the other women. In fact, I think he really does like you and wanted to make things work like a real marriage, except—" Sydney waited for him to continue, but he'd shoved his hands into the pockets of his jeans and was looking down at the ground. "Except?" she prompted. Whatever it was, it couldn't be good. Her hammering pulse told her that. "Except," he began, his gray eyes finally meeting hers. "He left a message late last night on my phone. I started driving here as soon as I heard it. But when I got here, he was already gone." "What do you mean, gone?" Sydney whispered. He reached out and took his phone, then pulled up the voicemail. "It's probably better if you listen to what he said." Sydney felt lightheaded as she began to listen to Ryan's message. Hearing his voice sent both a shiver and a shot of heat through her, anger mixing with cold dread. "Jake, yeah, I'm leaving the country. The real estate firm is trying to charge me with fraud, and to make a really long story short, I'm innocent. But there's no way I'll be able to fight against their allegations because they have everything rigged. If I was already married, this wouldn't be such a big deal because Sydney would have to stand by me. But there's no way she'll go through with the wedding now. The firm's digging up my past. I'm leaving my condo unlocked so you can move all my stuff out. You'll also have to sell my lease. I'm sorry to leave all of this in a message. Tell Mom and Dad, sorry too. Someday I'll make this up to them, I promise. Sydney lowered the phone, feeling lightheaded. Jake grasped her arm as if to steady her. What time did he send this? About 11:30 last night, Jake said. I had my phone on silent for the night, so I didn't see the message for a couple of hours. Where is he now? Sydney asked. I've called him over and over, Jake said. No answer yet. Sydney blinked against the burning in her eyes. Rian was gone, fleeing the country, without a word to her. Her mind whirled with their defunct wedding plans, all the people who were coming, what she would tell her best friends, what her parents would say. That Rian had dumped her without even telling her. I'm really sorry, Jake said, slipping an arm about her shoulders. She leaned against him. He was literally keeping her on her feet. After taking a few deep breaths, keeping her eyes closed, she finally drew away from Jake. Do you want to come in and sit down for a minute? Jake said. We can call my parents if you want any more information, at least about his past. Tears fell onto her cheeks, and Sydney swiped them away. I don't know what I want. I can't even think. Come on, Jake said, steering her into the condo and leading her to a couch that Sydney had sat on hundreds of times. Now it seemed like a foreign piece of furniture. The whole condo seemed different now. Sydney pulled her phone out of her pocket and fumbled with it for a moment as she pulled up Maria's phone number. I need to call someone, she said without looking at Jake. She felt like curling into a ball and crying, or ripping down everything from Ryan's wall and throwing it while screaming. Instead, she dialed Maria's number. Sydney, Maria said, what's happening? Can you conference in with June? Sydney said in a trembling voice. Of course, honey, what's wrong? Maria said. Just do it, Sydney whispered, closing her eyes and leaning back on the couch. Jake had gone into the kitchen, and somehow her mind registered that he was making coffee. When June answered, Sydney started crying. Sorry, girls, Ryan's gone. I mean, he's left me, and he's left the country, too. It's a crazy story, and I don't even know the half of it. Whoa, Maria said. Oh, no, June added. Sydney continued to tell them about Jake and what he'd revealed about Rian, the text messages and the final voicemail she'd listened to. While her friends offered their shocked condolences, both agreed they were on their way to Santa Rosa. We'll get to the bottom of it all, June said in a firm voice. And we're suing him, too, Maria said, right after we catch him and break his kneecaps. For some reason, Sydney found herself laughing through her tears. Talking to them had taken away some of the numbness, but with the fading numbness, her emotion sharpened and anger was at the forefront. She hung up with her friends. They'd all be together tonight, and that thought brought her comfort. But first, she had a long day ahead of her as she determined to get every bit of information out of Jake about his brother. 3. When Sydney hung up with her friend, she decided to wait to talk to her parents, at least after she caught her breath, found out more information about Ryan's deceptions, and got out of his condo. Coffee? Jake asked, coming into the front room. Sydney had no doubt he'd heard every bit of her conversation. Thanks, she said, taking the steaming mug from him. That it was a mug she recognized as Ryan's gave her another little jolt. She took a sip and relished the hot, strong liquid moving down her throat. Surprisingly, it was good coffee, and she was more surprised she could even taste or appreciate such a thing. Already she felt emotionally exhausted. It sounds like you have really good friends, Jake said, sitting on the other end of the couch. Sydney didn't mind. In fact, she was grateful for his company right now. If he'd left her alone, she'd probably just start crying again. As of now, she felt steadier. June and Maria were on their way, and she'd see them tonight. Yeah, she managed. They're coming to Santa Rosa to help me, to be with me. Well, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Jake said, his eyes scanning her face. Again, I'm really sorry. I thought, I hoped Ryan had started to change. Sydney shook her head. I don't understand how he couldn't have told me in person. I can understand why he thought I'd be upset. Of course I would be. I am upset. But don't I deserve to be told in person? We were engaged, in love. Jake was still gazing at her, and when she spoke of being in love with Ryan, Sydney wondered if it had been love, after all. Not on Ryan's part, at least. But what about her part? She'd always prided herself in dumping guys who weren't good for her, who saw her as a trophy. But Ryan had seemed different. He fit into her master plan, a plan that her friends had teased her about. In high school, she'd even written down a list of what her future husband should be like. Good-looking, athletic, good job, likes the same movies, likes horses, could spend a lot of time with her. It was juvenile, she knew, but over the years, no man had possessed all those qualities. Until she met Ryan. She should have added things like not a fraud, not a womanizer. Jake said nothing, just kept watching her as if waiting for her to crumble again. I don't even know how to process this. Did you guys combine finances yet? Jake asked. No, Sydney said. At least that was good news. We were both paying for different parts of the wedding costs. I even tried on my wedding dress this morning. The tears started again, hot and fast. Jake rose from the couch, grabbed a tissue box from across the room, and handed it to her. Then his phone rang, and Jake said, "It's Ryan. I'll put it on speaker, but don't let him know you're here yet." All right, Sydney said, wiping her eyes with a tissue and taking a steadying breath. Jake answered the phone, and Ryan's voice came through loud and clear. "Are you at my condo?" Ryan asked. "Yeah," Jake said. "Got here a few hours ago." "What are you doing, Ryan? You can't keep running like this. You've got to face those charges." "I can't, man," Ryan said. "They're going to lynch me. The charges are all bogus, and what's worse is that they've contacted Lila because they somehow got access to my records." Sydney assumed Lila was one of his former wives, the one who'd pressed charges that he'd apparently dodged. "Where are you?" Jake pressed. "Let's meet and talk about this." "Just landed in Mexico," Ryan said, triumph in his voice. "Before I disappear, there are some things you'll need to be aware of. I've got a lockbox under my bed that has some jewelry in it. You can pawn it if you want, but do it in another state, Ryan. And shred anything that has my name on it in the condo." Ryan continued, cutting off his brother. "My file cabinet is in the guest bedroom closet. I don't think. And the mountain bike is yours," Ryan continued. "Sell it, keep it, whatever. It's free and clear. Paid off completely." "I can come to Mexico," Jake cut in. "We really need to talk in person." "No can do," Ryan said. "I crossed the border for the last time. I'll find a real estate job here and a nice Mexican chick to translate for me." He started to laugh. "What about Sydney, your fiancé?" Jake asked when Ryan's laughter died down. "What about her?" Sydney couldn't breathe, couldn't move. What would Ryan do if he knew she was listening to every word? "Doesn't she deserve an explanation?" Jake said. You were engaged. I thought this one was different." There was a long pause, and Ryan said, "She was different, like 20 years younger different. I thought maybe I could be a better man for her, but you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Anyway, once you see her, you'll know that she'll have no problem nursing her broken heart with some new guy. She's a little hottie." He laughed, and the sound made Sydney's skin crawl. "I'll definitely miss her, if you know what I mean, but she's nothing that can't be replaced." Sydney covered her mouth to stop herself from yelling at Ryan. Horror washed through her at Ryan's callousness. How could she have ever agreed to marry such a man? She didn't know if she was more angry at herself or at Ryan. One glance at Jake told her he was angry too. Jake picked up the phone, switched it off speaker, and growled into it, "You're a bastard, Ryan." He stood and started pacing the room. "And believe me, I'm not touching any of the paperwork you're hiding in your files. If your place is searched, that's your problem. And I hope the feds track you down. You deserve to be in prison." Sydney watched Jake in shock as he hung up on his brother. Then he tossed the phone onto the couch and slammed his fist into the doorframe of the front door, causing the walls to rattle. He didn't speak or move for a moment, and then he turned to Sydney. "Where did Rian work?" It took Sydney a moment to process the calm Jake from the angry Jake she'd seen. "Across town at Smith's Realty." "I'm going down there to find out what the charges were, and if I need to, I'll be a witness on the case for the prosecution." Sydney rose to her feet. "Are you sure about that?" She had no idea why she was playing the devil's advocate. She'd just listened to her ex-fiancé completely diss on her. She should be crying her eyes out, but all she could focus on was the pain of the man in front of her. "He's your brother. Maybe you should let them sift their own evidence." Jake looked away from her for a moment, his jaw clenched. When his gaze met hers again, there was a steely determination in it. "Look, I never met any of the women Ryan swindled, but seeing you here in the flesh, a real, breathing person, makes me realize that I've screwed up for a long time. I should have turned my brother in after his first divorce. If I had, I could have prevented a lot of heartache, including yours." Sydney was stunned that he was taking Ryan's despicable acts upon himself. "You did nothing to me or to those women. In fact, it sounds like you've only been trying to help him, stop him from making more mistakes." He scrubbed a hand through his hair that was now dry in a messy contortion. If Sydney wasn't in the middle of a crisis, she might find the way Jake looked kind of adorable. "I appreciate what you're saying," Jake said, "but I've been an enabler. I see that clearly now, and I can't put this off any longer." He stepped around her and grabbed his phone from the couch. "Are you coming with me?" It was a question, but it was also more of a request. Sydney was sure her makeup was trashed and her nose red from crying, but she said, "I'm coming." Jake went to finish dressing, and moments later he came out of the back bedroom wearing a ball cap and shoes. Being away from him for a few minutes only re-emphasized his physical presence when he returned, making Sydney curious as to why Ryan was shorter and thinner than Jake. "We'll take my truck," he said. "I need to be doing something with my hands or I'll punch another door." Sydney looked down at his scraped knuckles. They weren't quite bleeding, but they had to be painful. "Do you want some ointment on your knuckles?" "No, I'm good." She followed him down the stairs to the parking lot, and he opened the passenger door and waited for her to climb in. Sydney felt an odd sense of self-consciousness. Not that men didn't open doors for her, but that Jake would think to do so when he was under so much duress. "Thanks," she told him as she settled into the seat. While Jake drove and she gave him directions, she texted an update to June and Maria. She told them she and Jake were driving to the realty office to talk to Ryan's boss. After she sent the group text, her cell rang. "Oh, no," she said, looking at the screen. "It's my mom." Jake looked over at her, and for a second they shared the silent communication of Sydney needing to tell her parents but being reluctant to do so. "I'd better answer," she said. "I'll pull over and give you some privacy," he said, slowing the truck. While Sydney answered, Jake parked beneath a row of trees next to a local park. He climbed out of the truck and shut the door. "Hi, Mom," Sydney said, the trembling in her voice already starting on the first two words. Her mother must be distracted because she jumped right in with, "So, how did the alterations on your dress go?" "Do you want the good news or the bad news first?" Sydney asked, trying to keep her breathing steady. Jake had walked into the park and was sitting on a bench, scrolling through his phone. For a moment, Sydney wished she could be out there with him instead of inside the truck telling her mom the bad news. "What's going on?" her mother said, her tone immediately filling with concern. "Is Dad there?" Sydney said. "That way I only have to say this all once." Her mother called to her dad, and when his voice came on the line, Sydney started to tear up. She could really use a hug from her parents right then. In a shaky voice, she told them everything she knew, then finished by telling them she was with Jake and they were headed to Ryan's former workplace. "Do you need us to come down, honey?" her dad asked. Maria and June are both on their way, Sydney told her parents. Thank you, though. I'll let you know if I need anything. After hanging up with her parents, she stayed in the truck for a few more minutes before climbing out and waving Jake back over. 4. Halfway through the meeting with Jake and Ryan's boss, Paul Smith, Sydney knew she needed a break. Jake and Paul had been comparing notes, and Jake had handed over files he'd brought from Ryan's condo. Sydney could see the pain this caused Jake, but he was 100% determined, which brought her a strange sort of comfort. Jake might have known about Ryan's deception longer, but they were both in this together now. Sydney wasn't the only one who'd been duped. Ryan's fraud ran deep into the realty company. Ironically, with Sydney's position as VP of Operations, she was over financial security as well, so this whole process was eye-opening. I'll be outside, Sydney told Jake in a quiet voice when Paul had to take a quick phone call. Jake looked over at her. Are you all right? She exhaled. Yeah, I just need a break. No rush on your part, though. All right, if you're sure, Jake said. His gaze seemed to pierce right through Sydney, not missing a thing. Text me if you need to go. I will, she said, then paused. What's your number? They exchanged numbers, then Sydney left the room and went outside to wait in Jake's truck. For several moments, she closed her eyes, letting all the information she'd learned soak in and fall into place like pieces of a puzzle. She still had so many questions, but mostly she knew the answers didn't matter all that much now. Bottom line, she'd been made a fool of, then dumped. She could cut her losses right then and there and walk away from the whole thing. Let Jake do whatever vigilante work he felt the need to, and she could move on with her life. First, though, she needed to start making phone calls and cancel her wedding plans. Hopefully, some of the deposits would be refundable. She opened her eyes and took a deep breath, then dialed the florist shop. After a short explanation, she called the catering company, followed by the rehearsal hall. With each phone call, she grew more resigned, but not more sad, which was a good thing. She'd completed her final call, leaving a message with the minister when the driver's door of the truck opened. You're still here, Jake said, surprise in his voice. Yeah, Sydney said with a shrug. Jake was studying her as if trying to gauge where she was in her grief cycle. Hungry? He asked. We can grab something if you want and go back to the condo. I can update you. Sydney knew she should say no, that she needed to regroup and start the process of contacting everyone she had sent invitations to. But she told herself that her friends could help her when they got into town. Sure, let's get something to eat, she said. One side of Jake's mouth lifted into a half smile. He really was good looking, but now wasn't the time to let her thoughts go. And besides, the brother of Rian could never be a consideration, no matter how different they were. What sounds good? Jake asked, starting the truck. Nothing, Sydney replied. I don't think I could even taste food right now. Well, then I guess I'll have to surprise you, Jake said as he pulled out onto the street. I noticed a Thai place as I drove into town early this morning. Do you like Thai? Sure, Sydney said, although she knew she sounded far from enthusiastic. Maybe some curry would help her think more clearly. They spoke little on the drive to the Thai place, and Jake went inside to order, leaving Sydney on the phone with the minister, who'd called her back. When Jake returned, carrying a couple of bags of boxed food, Sydney's stomach responded with a grumble. As they drove back to Ryan's condos, Sydney said, Where are you from, Jake? I mean, where do your parents live? They own a ranch about an hour north of here, Jake said. My dad's retired, so I manage the daily operations. My mom still does the accounting. Ryan worked there for a couple of years after high school, then went to college. We thought everything was going well until my mom got a notification of suspension in the mail from the college. Apparently, Ryan had dropped out and had already married an older woman, all without telling anyone. I guess he saw an easier way to make money. The disgust in his voice was evident, and Sydney was grateful for that. Did you go to college? Yes, ma'am, Jake said, glancing over at her. But I love the ranch, always have. I don't think my parents expected both of their sons to take over the family business, but believe me, they never expected Ryan to take the detour he did. Sydney nodded. The ironic thing is that I've dated some real jerks. I guess I didn't dig deep enough with Ryan. He turned out to be the worst of them all. Jake was quiet for a moment. There are worse men out there, of course. But I'm tired of Ryan hurting other people by his choices. He slowed the truck and turned into the condo parking lot. When he pulled to a stop, he looked over at her and said, "Something inside me snapped when he talked about you like you were a means to an end, like you weren't a person whose life just shattered." She held his gray-eyed gaze. The storm clouds were gathering inside of them again. "Thank you for telling me all you know," she said. "I would have always wondered if you hadn't shown up. And that would have been much worse than knowing the truth, despite how hard this all is." Jake's hand rested on hers, and the warmth of his touch somehow made Sydney feel both stronger and calmer. "I'll put it all to rights, Sydney." It was the first time she remembered he'd said her name, and something inside of her clicked, like deja vu, like they were supposed to connect. Of course, if Sydney was practical, she'd have met Jake eventually, being married to Ryan. Or would she have? If Ryan's company hadn't gone after him, how long would he have kept up the charade? Sydney would have married him, and then what? She looked down at Jake's hand on hers, so warm and strong, the pads of his fingers calloused. "It looks like you do a lot of ranch work," she said, turning over his hand, then moving hers away. "Not nearly as much as I used to," he said with a chuckle. "My dad tells me I'm getting soft." "You don't look soft," Sydney said, before clamping her mouth shut. "I mean, I don't know what I mean. Forget I said anything." Jake gazed at her, the gray of his eyes clear and glimmering. "Let's go eat." He opened his door and grabbed the bags of food. Before he could come around the truck and open her door, Sydney climbed out and joined him on the sidewalk. As they entered the condo, Sydney braced herself to feel the pain all over again. Yet, she only felt an echo of it. Inside, she felt hollow, but she also wasn't alone. She'd made the hard phone calls, and her friends were on their way to see her. She'd get through this, no matter how hard it might be. Jake set the bags on the kitchen table, and Sydney tried not to think of the time she and Ryan had eaten there. Mostly they'd gone out, but it was always fun to eat in as well. While Jake grabbed some drinks out of the fridge, Sydney set out the containers and opened all the lids. "You bought a lot of food," she said. "I mean, I know you said you were hungry, but..." "But what?" Jake said in an amused tone, coming to stand close to her. He set down a couple of forks and napkins, along with 2 water bottles. He turned to her and smiled. "You don't think I can put this away?" It was the first full smile she'd seen of Jake's, and it made her want to sit down so she could breathe better. She took one of the chairs. "I guess we'll see," she said, telling herself that she really needed to clear her mind. Her brain was doing crazy things right now. She focused on the food and putting a little of everything on her plate. The first bite of chicken massaman was delicious, and soon she was caught up in the good food and surprisingly comfortable company. "Are you from Santa Rosa?" Jake asked after he'd taken several bites, followed by a swig from his water bottle. Sydney told him about growing up with the best parents a girl could ever ask for, and how she'd been class valedictorian and homecoming queen in high school, but how that sometimes separated her from having genuine friends. June was new to the school, and she and Maria and I were put into the same study group. The 3 of us hit it off and ended up going to Washington University together. June's an accountant in Portland, and Maria does marketing in Seattle. Me? I'm lucky to have them as friends, even though I hate living so far away from them. "Sometimes friends can be better than family," Jake said. "Yeah, although if my parents had their way, I'd be married with a couple of grandkids for them," she said, feeling a deep sorrow start to churn inside. The feeling was unexpected. She and Ryan had talked about kids, of course, and he'd been eager to have at least one baby. But it wasn't until this moment that Sydney realized she'd lost that dream, too. Are your friends married? Jake asked in a light tone, as if trying to bring her back from another round of tears. Not yet, Sydney said. Both are in serious relationships, though, and I was going to be the first. She cut herself off. I don't know about men, but women seem to have this ticking clock inside of them that starts shooting alarms off around the age of 24. You can't be much older than that. Jake studied her with raised brows. Sydney shrugged. 26. How about you? Oh. You don't know your own age? Sydney said, smiling at him. I'm way past the ticking clock age, Jake said. Ryan is 28, so you're, what, 30? 32, Jake said, and Ryan's 30. Sydney shouldn't have been surprised. It seemed that Ryan hadn't told her much of the truth about anything. Your parents must be hounding you. You could say that, Jake said with a wink. Sydney felt a spot of heat spread up her neck until it was a full blush. The curry was pretty hot, she decided. So, no wife or kids? She asked. Jake set down his fork and took a long swallow of water. Sydney couldn't help watching his tanned throat move as he drank, and she looked away before he caught her stare. There was a woman, Charlotte, a couple of years ago, Jake said finally. We were engaged, but it didn't work out. It was Sydney's turn to raise her brows. Found out you were a gold digger, did she? He laughed, and Sydney laughed too. It felt good. Actually, she was entranced by the rancher's life, at least at first, he said. But when it came down to it, she preferred her city life. Ah, Sydney said. And you wouldn't give up the ranch for love. Something like that, Jake conceded. It all made me realize that maybe I didn't care for her as much as I thought I did. I could imagine living at the ranch without her, but not living in the city with her, if that makes sense. It does, Sydney said. She looked down at her empty plate. This was really good. Thanks for bullying me into it. It seems you needed someone to boss you into eating, he said. When she looked up, he was smiling at her. 5. It had been a really long day, but even though it was now well past dinner time, Sydney was still sitting on Ryan's couch, talking to Jake. He told her about his childhood and how Ryan was always the risk taker. Jake was the steady sort of kid, more serious, more cautious. He had told her all he could remember about Ryan's other marriages. Jake had never met any of the women until Sydney, but it seemed that she was the youngest of the lot. Sydney also told Jake more about herself, what she liked about Santa Rosa, how much she loved her job, but how she missed her parents and close friends. Ryan filled that emptiness inside of me, she admitted. Maybe I was lonely. I don't know. I had never really considered that we'd break up, but now that it's over, I feel more betrayed than heartbroken. And that surprises you? Jake asked. Yeah, I mean, I figure I must have been in love with him, Sydney said. Or why else would I agree to marry him? Jake grimaced. The heart is a strange thing. I thought I was in love with Charlotte, too. But maybe I was staring loneliness in the face with my parents getting older. Sydney blinked. Was that what had happened with Ryan? She was so caught up in getting married, living the rest of her life with someone, that she didn't think to find out more about his background? Looking back now, she realized that whenever they discussed it, Ryan had given her a short answer, then changed the subject. Her cell phone buzzed with a text from June. I'm at your place. Are you home? Sydney looked up at Jake. My friend June is at my place. I've got to go. She stood, and Jake stood as well. I guess I'll see you later, she said, feeling awkward. She'd felt as if she'd spilled a lot of personal things to Jake, and now she wondered if she'd ever see him again. If you'd like, I can keep you updated on Ryan, Jake said. I don't want to interfere too much, and if your friends want to talk, I'm happy to do that as well. How long are you staying? Sydney asked, glancing around at the condo. I'll box up his personal stuff and stick it in a storage unit here in town, Jake said. I don't want anything of his, and I don't want my parents to worry about it. Whoever buys the lease can keep the furniture, unless you want something. Sydney emphatically shook her head. He nodded, and before she could understand or explain how it happened, he pulled her into his arms for a tight hug. His embrace felt good, strong and sure, and like he really cared. Again, I'm so sorry, Jake said, his voice rumbling against her. I know I keep saying that, but it's true. I'm sorry too, Sydney said and drew away. Something inside her tugged her toward him again, but she forced herself to keep her distance and take a step back so she wouldn't be tempted to return his embrace. I'm sorry for your parents and for you. She lifted a shoulder. For me too, but I'll get over it. He held her gaze for a moment, then turned and opened the front door for her. She walked out of the door, neither of them saying another word, but she felt his gaze on her until she climbed into the car and drove away. By the time she reached her apartment building, she felt teary again, but this time it wasn't really for her own sorry experience, but for what Jake must face when he returned to the ranch and informed his parents that their youngest son had left the country. June was sitting in her car and climbed out as soon as Sydney pulled up. June wore black yoga pants and a pale green jacket. Her brown hair was pulled back in a ponytail. This was a casual look for June, who spent her days in a corporate accounting office. Sydney hurried to hug her friend, then drew back and said, "Thanks for coming." "Where were you?" June asked. "I was worried." "I was talking to Ryan's brother, Jake, the guy I told you about." They continued to Sydney's place. "You were okay being alone with him?" "He's so different from his brother." June gave her a sharp look. "What?" Sydney asked. June hesitated, then shook her head. "Nothing." Her phone rang and she answered it. "Hi, Maria. I just got here." "Yeah, that sounds great." She looked over at Sydney as she unlocked her apartment door. "Maria's going to grab some death-defying fried food and shakes." "Sounds good," Sydney said with a laugh. She said yes, June said. The last time Sydney had been inside her place, her world had been seemingly perfect. Now it was completely upside down. "I'm going to change," Sydney said. "Make yourself comfortable, and when Maria gets here, I'll tell you guys everything." Sydney walked into her bedroom and flipped on the light, then crossed the room and closed the blinds. On top of her dresser were several bridal catalogs and magazines. She'd have to throw all of that out now. As she changed, she wondered if she should help Jake in the morning. He'd have to move a lot of stuff, and he might put things in storage that could really be thrown out. Of course, if Sydney helped them, she might get too zesty and throw everything out. Smiling to herself, she opened her closet door to find a comfy t-shirt. It was strange that she'd just had the shock of her life, and here she was, looking forward to seeing Jake, and perhaps even exchanging a few more Ryan stories. Easy girl, Sydney warned herself. Jake might be sweet, caring, and understanding, and good-looking, but he was the jerk's brother and pretty much married to his ranch. Besides, how stupid was it to be attracted to the brother of a man who dumped her? She'd been attracted to Ryan. Did that make her a freak? Now that she'd met Jake, though, she could see all Ryan was missing. She sent Jake a text. "I don't work tomorrow because I was planning on getting wedding stuff done, but it seems my time is freed up. Do you want help packing up Ryan's stuff?" He replied a few seconds later. "I'd love it." The doorbell rang and Sydney left her bedroom. Maria had arrived with sacks of fast food that smelled divine. Maria's dark curls were pulled back in a clip, making her look elegant, as always. She grinned when she saw Sydney and set down the bags to give her a fierce hug. "I want all the dirt," Maria announced. June laughed from the kitchen where she was gathering plates. Sydney couldn't help but smile. "You'll get all the dirt and more, I promise." "And you have to tell us more about Jake," June said, coming into the living room. "Jake? The brother?" Maria asked, her brows shooting up. "First things first," Sydney said. "Let's eat. I'm starving." And she was. The Thai food she'd shared with Jake had been hours ago, and all this emotional turmoil had suddenly made her feel ravenous. They ate in the living room, sitting on the couch and balancing the plates on their knees. The combination of hot French fries, fresh cheeseburgers, and strawberry milkshakes was more than perfect. Sydney told them everything that had happened that day, from trying on her gorgeous wedding dress to meeting a grumpy Jake who'd turned out to be a godsend. "I don't know what I would have done if Ryan had dropped off the face of the earth without any explanation," Sydney told her friends. "Wow," Maria said. "From everything you've told us, Jake is like a knight in shining armor. Too bad he's Ryan's brother," Sydney mused, mostly to herself. June and Maria exchanged a glance, and Sydney said, "What was that for?" Sydney?" Maria started. "You're sort of glowing right now. What's up with this Jake guy?" If Sydney had been glowing, now she was blushing. "Nothing is up. We just spent all day together, and let's say he's the real deal." Both Maria's and June's mouths fell open. "Not like that," Sydney said. "I'm not going to be dating anyone for a really long time, but there is something to be said for a guy who's decent and honest." "Of course," Maria said, but she was still staring at Sydney as if Sydney might be losing her mind, which could very well be the case. "Anyway," Sydney continued, "you guys can meet him. I'm going over to Ryan's place in the morning to help Jake box everything up. Jake's going to put it into a storage unit, then probably throw away the key." "I'm in," Maria said immediately. "Me too," June said, a secretive smile on her face. "Wouldn't miss it for anything." Sydney and her friends talked long into the night, and when Sydney finally tumbled into bed, she found another text from Jake. "Everything go okay with your friends?" It was after midnight, but Sydney sent a reply. "Yep, they're great. Thanks for asking." Jake's answer came quickly. "Good to hear. See you soon." Sydney fell asleep with a smile. 6. "That's pretty much everything," Jake said, hoisting the final box they'd packed onto his shoulder. Sydney put her hands on her hips, telling herself not to stare at his muscled shoulders and arms as he loaded the boxes into his truck. She and Maria and June had been cleaning the condo as Jake carried everything they deemed salvageable out. "That went faster than I thought." "Yeah, thanks for your help." Jake looked past her to the kitchen where Maria and June were wiping down cupboards and counters. Jake tilted his head. "Can I talk to you outside for a second?" "Sure," Sydney said, glancing over at her friends. They hadn't seemed to hear Jake's request, which might be a good thing. They'd given her plenty of questioning looks all morning. When Maria had first seen Jake, she'd whispered, "Wow, I get it now." June had followed up with, "You're in trouble." Sydney had brushed off their comments and set to work. Jake was easygoing and easy to work with. It was clear he was no stranger to hard labor, and the packing went quickly. She'd found herself laughing more than once at something Jake said about his brother. Each laugh helped ease the pain. Sydney followed Jake to the truck, where he set down the box he carried on top of the others. "So, I was thinking last night," he started, turning to face Sydney. The collar of his t-shirt was damp with sweat, and he was slightly out of breath. Sydney's pulse twinged as she met his gaze. "Yes?" He stared at her for a second, blinked a couple of times, then said, I was thinking that if you wanted, since it's the weekend, you could come out to the ranch with me." It was Sydney's turn to stare. Why would I do that? She cringed at her own comment, but it was what she was wondering. Jake ran his hand through his hair, messing it up more than it already was. "Right, good question." He looked away, then back at her, his eyes a dark gray. Not stormy, but intent. "Because I want my parents to meet you. They'll have questions that I haven't thought about asking you, and I think it would help soften the shock. Ryan's not only left you, but he's left all of us." Sydney nodded. It made sense. So why were her thoughts betraying her and telling her that Jake really wanted to spend more time with her? That was ridiculous. Of course he was dreading bringing all this news back to his parents. "It's an hour away?" "Yeah," Jake said. "You could follow me out. It's up to you if you want to stay overnight or not." There's plenty of room, of course, and you might enjoy taking a break from work and everything going on. Could my friends come too? Maria and June? Jake asked, looking surprised and a bit pale. Sydney laughed. I'm kidding. Good, he said, because I think it would be easier to get to know you better without an entourage. You want to get to know me better? She asked, her heart thumping. He merely gazed at her for a moment, and when she was about to break into a sweat, he said, I do. She folded her arms and leaned against the side of the truck, suppressing a satisfied smile. I'm not opposed to seeing your ranch. When are you heading out? He folded his own arms and leaned against the truck, only a short distance from her. First thing in the morning. I still need to unload this truck and turn in the condo keys to the office, but I can wait until Sunday if you need more time. He was close enough that she could smell the soap he showered with and faint perspiration. I don't need more time, Sydney said. My friends are leaving tomorrow anyway. His brows lifted slightly and a smile played on his face. Are you sure you want to come? Trying to change my mind? Definitely not, he said. And then he took a sidestep closer to her and leaned down. Sydney, there you guys are, Maria's voice called out. Your phone's ringing. It looks like your mom. Sydney didn't move for a second, and neither did Jake. His gaze had gone from her eyes to her mouth, and back up. If Maria hadn't interrupted, Sydney wondered if Jake would have kissed her. Coming, Sydney said, glancing up at Maria. Maria lifted her hands, flashing a grin, then turned back around to go inside the condo. When she looked back to Jake, he'd straightened again, and his expression was neutral. Maybe she'd been imagining things, hoping for the impossible, making herself a fool twice. We'll come with you to unload, she said. Give me a second. I'm not going anywhere, he said, his voice completely serious. She hurried up the stairs, a thrill running through her at Jake's words. She burst into the condo to see June and Maria, who were spying out the window. They both jumped back, their faces red. Save me, Sydney whispered, shutting the door behind her. I think I have a crazy crush on my ex-fiancé's brother. How insane is that? Maria gasped, then laughed, and June's eyes about bugged out. I'm so sorry I interrupted you too, Maria said. My timing is horrible. Maria told me he was about to kiss you, June said. Sydney waved a hand in front of her face as if she could create a cool flow of air. She sank onto the couch. I don't know. This is all making my head spin. But, you guys, he asked me to go to his family's ranch with him tomorrow to help talk to his parents about Rian. Meet his parents? Maria asked, her brows skyrocketing. Sydney puffed out a breath of air. Not like that. Maria and June laughed. I like him, June declared. I don't care if his brother dumped you 24 hours ago. Jake's a keeper. Sydney hung her head. Why did I have to meet Rian first? Maria and June settled next to her on the couch, and Maria draped an arm around her shoulders. I guess it was the only way to meet Jake. Burying her face in her hands, Sydney groaned. Come on, June said. Let's get out of here. We're finished, and I can't wait to see what happens next in this Sydney saga. Sydney lifted her head. I told him we'd help him unload at the storage unit. June rubbed her hands together and smiled. Sounds good to me. Maybe Maria and I can grab lunch on the way and meet you two there. Give you some more quality time alone. Sydney slapped June's leg. This is serious. I'm drowning here. If you were better friends, you'd be helping me, not teasing me. Isn't it the same thing? Maria said with a grin. Sydney's phone started ringing where she'd left it on the mantel. Oh, yeah, my mom. Great timing. Just tell her not to worry. You've already moved on to the next guy, June said. Maria laughed. Talk to your mom while I drive us over to the storage lot. Sydney grabbed her phone and answered. Her mother's questions came at her like an open fire hose. Sydney followed Maria and June out of the condo and climbed into Maria's car. I can't return the wedding dress, Sydney told her mom as they drove. I'll sell it online or something. Or keep it, June whispered from the front seat. Jake will like it. Sydney glared at her friend. I'm all right, she assured her mother, who was asking how she'd slept and if she was eating. Maria and June are taking care of me. In fact, we're helping Ryan's brother clean out the condo." There was a significant pause, and Sydney regretted telling her mom that fact. "I know what you're thinking, but Jake's nothing like Ryan. In fact, I'm going out to the family ranch tomorrow." She continued to explain recent events to her mother while Maria pulled into a fast food stop and ordered several items from the menu. Once they had their food, Sydney had convinced her mom that she wasn't making dumb decisions. "I like your mom," Maria said when Sydney hung up. "Because she still thinks she can tell me what to do, even though I'm 26? Sydney asked with a scoff. "Pretty much," Maria said as they pulled into the storage unit lot. "I like her too," Sydney said. "I probably shouldn't have told her about going to Jake's ranch, though." Maria looked over at her and winked. 3 rows down was Jake's truck, and he was already at work unloading. "I think you're going to have a lot more fun than you think on that ranch," Maria said. June chimed in. "I'd be surprised if he doesn't kiss you in the next couple of days." "Why would you say that?" Sydney asked, not wanting to get her hopes up, while at the same time telling herself she was jumping way ahead of where she was emotionally. "I've seen the way he looks at you," June continued, looking back at Sydney with raised brows. "Mm-hmm," Maria added. "How?" Sydney said as Maria parked the car not far from the truck and turned off the engine. "He just seems very aware of you," June said. "Agreed," Maria said, then opened her door, cutting off all further conversation. "Wait," Sydney hissed, and Maria pulled her door shut again. "What should I do? I mean, I need to figure out what went wrong and where to go from here, not be caught up in some rebound crush on my ex-fiancé's brother." "Don't overthink it," June said. "Go with your gut. That's what I did with Lance and Maui." "She's right," Maria said. "Crap happened to you. But maybe it wasn't all bad. Maybe it happened for a reason, and the reason is that man over there." "So you guys don't think this is creepy?" Sydney pressed. "If I didn't understand the circumstances and didn't see Jake for myself," Maria said. "But June's right. And if you move to the next step with Jake, I'm okay with it." "I'm okay with it, too," June said, smiling. "You guys are no help at all," Sydney complained, although her heart thudded with hope and anticipation. Maria grinned and opened her car door again. "Time to help rebound, man." 7. "Just go with it," Sydney told herself more than once that morning as she got ready to go to the ranch with Jake. "Don't overthink it." 20 minutes ago, she'd hugged her friends goodbye before they set off back to their cities and jobs and boyfriends. Then she caught up on a bunch of emails that had been piling up during her 2 days off. Even though she'd created an autoresponder, some of them were urgent. That morning, Jake had texted to see if he could pick her up so they could drive together and have a chance to put their plan together. He told her he'd bring her back whenever she was ready. At first, Sydney had hesitated. What if things went sour and Jake drove her back home in a cloud of silence? This made her feel more determined to keep things platonic between them, even though she'd been awake half the night thinking of everything he'd said to her, and that almost kiss out in the parking lot. When they'd unloaded at the storage unit, Jake had been friendly to Maria and June like usual, and Sydney also noticed that he paid special attention to her. It was like he was watching her constantly. So maybe what June had said was right. Several times she'd caught his gaze on hers, and each time she felt a little warmer at the attention. Rebound guy. Is that what he was? At least in her mind? She couldn't imagine going to his family's ranch and meeting his parents and trying to hook up with him. Maybe this was her heart and mind's way of protecting her from the crushing pain of Ryan's betrayal. She was locking that away and hyper-focusing on the thing or person closest to Ryan, his brother. Not that they had a close relationship, but they shared the same DNA and same childhood. Sydney's phone buzzed with a text. "We love you and have fun." It was from Maria, but June was included in the group text. Before Sydney could reply, someone knocked on the door. Jake was already here. She grabbed her overnight bag and purse and headed to the door. She opened it, and her breath stalled. He wore jeans again and a button-down shirt. His hair was combed, but in a rebellious sort of way. But it was his smile that made her pulse drum. She couldn't ever remember feeling like this when she saw Rian. It had been more of looking at their relationship from a logical standpoint. "Ready?" Jake asked. "Yeah," she said, wondering if she sounded as breathless as she felt. All her thoughts about Jake during the night didn't really do justice to the man in the flesh. "Great," he continued, oblivious to the turmoil of her thoughts. He reached out a hand and took her bag. "Thanks," she said, then shut the apartment door and locked it. Apparently they were having a one-worded conversation. "I grabbed some coffee on the way," he said as they headed down the stairs to the parking lot. "Unless you've already had yours." She had, in fact, but she said, "Sounds great, thanks." Could she sound more awkward? "Are your friends already gone?" he asked. "They left a few minutes ago," she answered and opened the passenger door as Jake set her bag in the bed of the truck. The smell of the interior of the truck had become familiar, and Sydney realized that she was feeling relaxed, where she had been a bundle of nerves before Jake had arrived. She took a sip of the coffee, then set it back into the drink holder. Jake climbed in and started the truck, then looked over at her. "Thanks for doing this." "I think it's a good idea," Sydney said. "I want to be helpful to your parents as much as possible." He gave a thoughtful nod, then backed out of the parking slot. As he pulled onto the road, he said, "They're gonna be heartbroken, but I'm glad you'll be there to ease the pain. Ryan has been hurting them long enough. At least with him leaving the country, maybe they can begin to heal." "What about you?" Sydney asked, wondering if the question was too personal. Jake was quiet for a moment as he navigated through the morning traffic and headed for the highway. "I was livid when I first got his texts, and when I found his condo abandoned." He glanced at her, then moved his focus back at the road. "Spending time with you has changed everything." Sydney couldn't speak for a moment. "For the better, I'm hoping." "Definitely." He gave her a half smile, then reached over and squeezed her hand. She didn't move after he released her hand. She could barely think or breathe as it was. She wanted to ask him to explain himself more, but she was afraid to hear her answer. "This is a beautiful area," Jake said as he pulled onto the highway and they passed grove after grove of trees. "Was it your job that brought you here?" "Yeah, I was recruited out of college, and it seemed a great place to live," Sydney said. She told him about her last few years working for the software firm. "When I was promoted, my work hours suddenly multiplied. Ryan hated my long hours, and it was always a struggle to get together without feeling stressed about what I'd left behind at work. Over the last few weeks, though, Ryan had been busier than usual. Now I know why." Jake's lips tightened into a thin line. "If he ever returns to this country, he'll be indicted." Sydney leaned her head back against the seat and looked over at Jake. "Your poor parents. I can't imagine what it would be like to be in their shoes." "That's why I've tried to be the buffer as much as possible," Jake said. "They don't know everything that I do, but they know enough. And I can't keep this latest disaster from them." They were quiet for a moment. The only sound, the hum of the tires on the road, and the faint music coming from the radio. "So why are you different?" Sydney asked. "Why are you the good brother?" He shrugged. "I don't really see it that way. It's more of a question of why does Ryan do what he does? I've done research on mental illnesses, but nothing seems to really fit. He doesn't think about the consequences of his actions. It's like he has no conscience. It doesn't make sense. We grew up the same way, but our paths have been completely different." His voice grew lower as he spoke, as if he was trying to keep back emotion. Sydney grasped his hand, and he linked their fingers together. This time, neither of them pulled away. It felt comfortable, and Sydney was only mildly blushing. Holding Jake's hand felt natural, even though he was Ryan's brother. In a way she couldn't explain, she felt in sync with Jake. The drive went by faster than Sydney expected, and soon they were pulling into a long driveway that led to a sprawling ranch-style house surrounded by acres and acres of grazing land. "Wow," Sydney said, straightening in her seat. "This is gorgeous." Jake had released her hand a few minutes ago to make the turns, but she still felt as if his touch were imprinted on her skin. The house was a deep red brick with white trim and a huge wraparound porch. Several barns spread out behind the house, and other smaller buildings dotted the property. What seemed like miles of fence separated the fields from the dirt road that ran the length of the property. A row of garages sat on one side of the house, and Drake drove toward them. This gave Sydney a better glimpse of what was behind the house, a well-kept stable. "You have horses, too?" Jake laughed. "It's a ranch, honey." Honey, Sydney thought. She didn't think Jake understood what he'd exactly said. If anything, he was teasing her. "Do you ride?" Jake asked, parking the truck inside the garage he'd opened by remote control. "In an arena," Sydney said. "Not really nature. I know." She didn't tell him she'd tried to get Rian to ride with her before her work had become so busy, but he'd always come up with an excuse and, of course, had never told her he'd grown up on a ranch where apparently his family owned horses. Jake was looking at her with interest. "We can fix that." He rested a hand on the headrest of her seat, bringing his clean scent much closer to her. "I feel like I should warn you about something," he said. Sydney looked into his gray eyes and saw complete calmness there. "My mom can be excitable," he continued. His fingers touched her hair, and even though she could barely feel his touch, warm shivers traveled through her. "She'll see me arriving with a beautiful woman and assume a lot, even when she discovers that you were engaged to Rian." "So you're saying she'll think that Ryan's ex is fair game?" Sydney asked. The truck seemed extra warm, and he seemed extra close, even though they'd been sitting in the same places for an hour. "What I'm saying is that my parents are going to like you a lot." "You sound pretty sure," Sydney said, trying to hold back a smile. "Our tastes are similar, and since I like you, I have little doubt they will too." Jake's fingers rested on her shoulder. "So if I like you, then I'll like them," she said. His lips lifted at the corners. "I hope so." He leaned forward, and for a breathless moment she thought he might kiss her. But then reality slammed into her. She'd been dumped, duped, and discarded 2 days ago by this man's brother. She had no business kissing Jake. Breaking his mesmerizing gaze, she reached for the door handle. Jake didn't move, just watched her. And for once, his gray eyes were murky, unreadable. 8. Jake had been 100% right, Sydney decided. When they walked into the kitchen, they found his mother sitting at the table with a laptop and paper strewn all over. Her light brown hair, streaked with plenty of gray, was pulled into a messy bun, and right in the middle she'd stuck a pencil. Jake's mother reminded Sydney of a schoolteacher in a Norman Rockwell painting. She was slim like Rian, although her eyes were the gray of Jake's. When she saw Jake, she jumped to her feet. "Jake!" Then she threw her arms about his neck. "You're back!" And she peered around him, glanced at Sydney, her eyes widening, then said, "Where's Rian? And who's this?" She looked back at Jake and waggled her eyebrows. "Mom, this is Sydney," Jake said, holding up his hand. "But before you ask her a million questions, we need to sit down and talk." His mother covered her mouth with her hand, and tears filled her eyes. "Oh, my goodness. You didn't." She rushed forward and hugged Sydney, nearly knocking her off balance. Then she drew back, leaving Sydney speechless. "Did you two elope?" Jake's mom started to laugh or cry. Sydney wasn't sure which. "Mom," Jake said, wrapping an arm about her shoulders and steering her to the table. "Sit down. Sydney and I aren't married. She's a friend. Where's Dad?" His mother frowned. "You're engaged, then?" Her expression softened. "I'm so sorry to jump to conclusions, Sydney. It's just that Jake..." "Mom, where's Dad?" Jake cut in again in a firm voice. "This is really important, and please stop asking Sydney questions that are making her really uncomfortable." His mother snapped her mouth closed. Then, in a rush, she said, "Your father's upstairs. He was washing up for dinner, but he's probably fallen asleep. He's been up there for a while now. That reminds me, the casserole." She rose from her chair and hurried across the kitchen, then opened the oven to peek inside. "Oh, it's perfect. Maybe a tad overdone, but that's perfect in my book." She turned off the oven and grabbed oven mitts. "Do you need help?" Sydney asked, walking around the counter. To Jake, she said, "I'm fine here. Go find your father." He looked between the women for a second, doubt on his face, then said, "I won't be long." Sydney waved him off, then said to his mother, "I can set the table." "That would be wonderful." She set a pan of bubbling lasagna on the stovetop, then pushed back a strand of her hair and smiled at Sydney. "Sorry for the enthusiasm. I'm really happy for you two." Before Sydney could correct, Jake's mother grasped her hands. "Jake must be smitten to bring you here, and I'm not surprised. You're beautiful." Maybe Sydney should have told Jake to stay in the kitchen and sent his mother to get his dad. "You're sweet, Mrs. Stevenson, but," Sydney said, moving to the table to see what she could clear off. "Oh, call me Judy. There's no formalities here, as you can clearly see," Judy said. "In fact, I've taken to doing the accounting on the kitchen table lately because the north-facing office is too cold in the mornings, and I'm far from sweet once you get to know me. I'm a bit of a frazzled mess right now, trying to figure out where all the money went last month." She laughed. "I'm rambling, aren't I? Today's your day to share the good news." Sydney still hadn't gotten a word in when Judy clapped her hands together. "Oh, the salad. I forgot to fix it up." "I can do that," Sydney said. "Why don't you clear off the table, since I don't want to mix up your paperwork?" "Smart and decisive," Judy said with a soft smile on her face. "I like that. You'll be good for Jake." "Mother," Jake said, a warning in his voice as he walked into the kitchen with a man who looked quite a bit like Jake, albeit an older version. Mr. Stevenson's hair was nearly white, but he had kept his shape fine, and his blue eyes reminded Sydney of Rian. She ignored that thought and smiled as Jake said, "Dad, this is Sydney." "Nice to meet you," his dad said, his gaze friendly but watchful. Sydney extended her hand, and they shook. "Well," Jake continued, "it looks like we're having our discussion over lunch." "We rise early on the ranch, so our lunchtime is earlier than most people," Judy said, smiling broadly at Sydney. Sydney's chest tightened at the thought of what Judy's expression might be when she found out about Rian. She went back to mixing the salad. Judy had already chopped everything, and by the time it was mixed, Judy and Jake had set the table, and Mr. Stevenson filled glasses with ice water. They all sat down, and for a moment nostalgia swept through Sydney at the act of sitting down to dinner with two parents. Judy served up the lasagna, and everyone passed the salad around. "What's this big news?" Mr. Stevenson asked, looking from Jake to Sydney. Jake took a sip of water, then folded his hands on the table and leaned forward. "I'm sorry to be blunt and to show up like this without any warning, but I've wanted to tell you both in person." "It's about Rian, isn't it?" his dad said. Jake nodded. "Did you spend some quality brother time together?" Judy asked, hope in her voice. "I didn't even see him," Jake said. "What?" his father asked at the same time his mother said, "I thought that's what you were doing this whole time." Jake started to explain everything, play by play, from when Rian first texted him to when Sydney came looking for Rian. "You're Ryan's fiancé?" Judy said, obviously stunned. "Ex-fiancé," Jake clarified. Sydney could only watch helplessly as Judy's face went from shock to disbelief to hurt as Jake continued the story about his desperate attempts to get a hold of Rian, his pleas to get him to return to the country, and his meeting with the real estate firm that was pressing fraud charges. Judy covered her mouth with her hand as her eyes watered. Mr. Stevenson stood, shoving away the chair, and began to pace the kitchen. He fired out a few questions, which Jake answered. His mother started to cry. Sydney scooted over closer and wrapped her arm about Judy's shoulders. One man's choices had done all of this. After a few minutes, Mr. Stevenson stopped his pacing and returned to the table. He placed a hand on his wife's shoulder, then said, "Today is the last day you'll cry over Ryan's actions. Tomorrow, we're only looking toward our future, one without Rian." We can't keep living with these ups and downs. Ryan's not going to change, and we'll have to accept that. His leaving the country has shown us where his priorities are, and they aren't with his family." Judy nodded and placed her hand on her husband's. "It just hurts so much." She used her other hand to grip Sydney's. "And this poor girl has been caught in our sticky web." "I made my own decisions about Ryan," Sydney said. "I don't blame any of you." She glanced over at Jake, who looked as if he was holding back a comment. She knew he blamed himself for some of Ryan's actions, but Jake had done all he could. "You're a good woman," Judy said, patting Sydney's hand. "Thank you for coming all this way." She reached for a napkin on the table and blew her nose. Then she looked up at her husband. "Well, let's eat," she said with a watery smile. "I didn't go to all this trouble to have it grow cold." Her husband leaned down and kissed his wife's cheek and said, "You're an amazing woman." Then he moved to his place at the table and sat down. "Shall we?" Mr. Stevenson and his wife began to eat, taking small bites, and Sydney looked over at Jake. He nodded at her, then picked up his fork. That was it? She wondered. A few minutes of ranting and crying, and now everything was normal again? All Sydney had done was put an arm about Judy. Jake had thought his parents would need more closure, and meeting Sydney would help with that. But they were handling this much better than she expected. She picked up her own fork and started to eat. If anything, maybe the drive had been worth it to taste Judy's lasagna. It was the perfect blend of spices and tomatoes and pasta, still warm enough to enjoy. As they ate, Jake's dad asked a few stilted questions about the indictment procedures, and Jake's answers seemed to satisfy him that Jake was on top of everything. "Thanks for all your hard work," Mr. Stevenson told Jake. "I don't know where we went wrong with Ryan, but he's a fool to give up a woman like Sydney." Sydney's face heated, and Jake gazed at her. "It's definitely Ryan's loss." "I'm glad Jake stuck around to explain things to me," Sydney said. "I would have been pretty confused to find that my fiancé had completely disappeared on me." "Tell us about your family, Sydney," Judy said. So Sydney did. Long after the meal was eaten, and quite well, Sydney was still answering questions from Jake's parents. Jake had taken it upon himself to clear the table, then bring over more water and a plate of brownies that apparently Judy had also baked that morning. He didn't ask any questions or add to the conversation, just leaned back in his chair, arms folded, a satisfied look in his eyes. A clock somewhere in the house chimed, and Mr. Stevenson looked at his watch. "It's nearly noon," he said. "Back to work." He looked at Jake. "You better show this young lady around the property. Maybe take her on a ride." "I was thinking the same thing," Jake said. Judy rose and crossed to Jake as he stood. She pulled him into a hug. "You're a good son, Jake, and thanks for bringing Sydney along. You take care of her, you hear?" "Yes, Mom," Jake said, looking over at Sydney and giving her a wink. The wink traveled straight to her toes, eating her body as it went. 9. "Your parents are extremely resilient," Sydney said as they walked slowly to the stables behind the house. "They're ranchers through and through," Jake said. "They don't give up easily, but they also keep moving forward no matter what." Sydney nodded. They stepped into the stables, and after her eyes adjusted, Sydney said, "This place is amazing." Nearly a dozen horses stood in well-kept stalls, and everything seemed freshly cleaned. A hayloft spread across one side of the stable, making the place feel old-fashioned at the same time. "Come, me Buddy and Betty." He led her to the first two stalls, where two russet-colored horses stood, practically prancing at the side of Jake. "They're twins." "Which one's Buddy?" Sydney asked. "You're looking at him. And I think he has a crush on you already," Jake said. Buddy was trying to nuzzle Sydney's neck. "Hello, boy," she said in a soft voice, letting the horse smell her. Then she stroked his forehead. "He's beautiful." "Now you'll have to compliment all the other horses, or they'll get jealous," Jake teased. Sydney laughed. "Is that right?" She continued stroking Buddy. It seemed he wasn't going to let her move on any time soon. Jake grabbed some carrots from a pail on the floor and fed a couple of them to Betty. Sydney watched Jake out of the corner of her eye. I don't know why you wanted me to come. Your mother cried herself out in about 2 minutes, and then it seemed life went on as usual. Jake turned to look at her, his eyes dark gray. You caught me. Raising her brows, she said, Caught you? Jake reached out and grasped her free hand. Maybe I had more personal and selfish reasons for bringing you out here. They'd been standing close already, but Sydney hadn't realized how close until now. What kind of reasons? I wanted you to see the ranch, he said, one side of his mouth lifting. And meet my parents, of course, so you'd know that not all Stevensons are crooks. I never thought. He stepped closer, and Sydney forgot what she was protesting about. His other hand slid around her waist. Her heart was thumping so hard that if Jake had tried to say something, she wouldn't have been able to speak. But he wasn't intent on speaking. Instead, he leaned down and kissed her. Sydney should have been shocked, but all thought and reason had fled the moment he'd taken her hand. Jake's mouth moved against hers, slow but intense, sending darts of heat through her body. She didn't move at first, just relished the warmth of his lips and the heat of his breath. And then she gripped the front of his shirt and pressed against him. Both of Jake's arms went around her, pulling her in tightly against his body as his mouth continued to explore hers. Sydney couldn't quite believe she was kissing Jake, that he was kissing her, and that she didn't want this kiss to end. Jake rotated her until her back was against the stall. Sydney, he whispered, kissing along her jaw. What? She whispered back as her insides melted at the sensations running through her at his touch. His answer was another full kiss on her mouth as he seemed to drink her in, as if she was his oasis. Sydney had never really thought she'd missed out on kissing, and she'd kissed plenty of men and had enjoyed it enough. But Jake was all-encompassing, taking command of every sense she'd ever known, and some that might be new. Who said there were 5 senses? There had to be at least 20. Sydney, Jake said again. Jake? Sydney replied, feeling like laughing or giggling or simply swooning. He drew back enough to gaze at her. He smiled, then lowered his head again to kiss the throbbing pulse in her neck. He murmured, better than I thought. She ran her hands along his shoulders, then rested them on his chest, feeling the thump of his heart. Better than what? You taste better than I imagined. He was looking at her again, and Sydney's heart flipped. She wasn't sure if she'd ever had a man look at her with such complete want. What did you imagine? She whispered. Sweetness, maybe with a little spice, he said, grinning. And what did you get? A lot more spice. He brushed his mouth against hers, lingering. After another few moments, he said, I've wanted to kiss you since I opened my brother's door. In your towel? Yeah, that would have been really forward, he said with a chuckle. So be happy I restrained myself. He released her waist and lifted his hand to trace a finger along her jaw, then down her neck. You seriously wanted to kiss me when you first saw me? She asked, staring at him and trying to stay calm, although his touch was making her breathing do crazy things. How does that happen? I'm not a scientist. I know what I want, I guess. I like that about you, Sydney admitted. Jake gazed at her for another long moment, then dipped his head. This kiss was more defined, more urgent, and definitely more passionate. Sydney was heating up fast, and if she wasn't careful, she might be dragging him to the hayloft. Not that he'd need dragging by the way he was kissing her. Jake, Sydney said, breaking off the kiss, aren't your parents going to wonder where we are? Yeah, you're right. The sheepish look on his face made Sydney laugh. Promise you'll stay tonight, Jake said. I don't want you to leave yet. Staying tonight might be a wise thing or a foolish thing, but Sydney didn't care at this moment. I'll stay. His smile was slow. Mmm, good. He drew back and stepped away. It seemed he, too, needed space to cool down. They spent the next few minutes saddling the two horses, leading them out of the stables and into the gorgeous surroundings, and nearly took Sydney's breath away. I get why you love this ranch, she said. Jake looked over at her. Do you? He asked in a thoughtful tone. She looked away because the intensity in his eyes made her heart leap into her throat, and she couldn't stop thinking about how it felt to kiss him, to touch him, and to have his hands on her. Where are we riding to? Just around the perimeter of the ranch, Jake said. Nothing too intense. His gaze was intense enough. Here, he said, grasping the reins of her horse. Let me help you mount. He held the horse steady, and she placed her left foot into the stirrup, then hoisted herself up and swung over. Got it? Jake asked, looking up at her, his hand on her calf. He was starting to travel up her leg. Got it, she said. Jake smiled, then mounted his own horse and flicked the reins. They rode at an easy pace, and Jake pointed out the ranch's property lines, which extended well beyond the grazing fields. He told her about the cattle they grazed and the number of employees they had, which amounted to 4 ranch hands in addition to Jake's parents. Sydney was surprised at the small number. Do you think your parents will ever retire? Not fully, Jake said. I'm sure my mother would be happy to turn over the book someday, but she'll never stop bossing everyone around. Sydney laughed. She could very well imagine that. They reached a small valley that dipped below the main ranch property. Come on, Jake said, pulling ahead of her on a narrow path that wound through a copse of trees. There's a stream down here. Sydney followed him on her horse, and moments later they arrived at a meadow that was edged by a stream. Wildflowers dotted the meadow, and the sound of the gurgling water made the place look like it was out of some fairy tale. A few boulders lined the other side of the stream. Those are my thinking rocks, Jake said, pointing to the boulders. Thinking rocks? Jake reined his horse to a stop and dismounted. Then he held out his hand to Sydney and helped her dismount. She slipped to the ground, landing right next to Jake, who hadn't stepped back to give her room. Yeah, Jake said, his hands resting on her waist. This is where I come to think, since I was a little boy. My dad showed me the place. Once when we were in an argument over something that I don't even remember, both my dad and I showed up here. It was pretty funny. Sydney smiled up at him. Did you fight over the rocks? Jake pulled her close, looping his arms about her waist. We both saw the irony of the situation, and our argument was forgotten, for the moment, at least. Your dad seems like a great guy, Sydney said, resting her hand on his shoulder. And he's lucky to have you for a son. Lines creased the space between his brows, and Sydney reached up to smooth them. You can't make up for your brother's actions, you know. I know, Jake said, but Sydney didn't miss the storm gathering in his gray eyes. I'm glad your parents have you, Sydney said. Jake stared at her for a moment, and then he leaned down and kissed her. The kiss was gentle, more familiar, and sweeter than anything Sydney had ever experienced. She wrapped her arms around his neck and let herself become lost in him as the sun's rays surrounded them. It looks like you do more than think in this place, Sydney said in a quiet voice when he broke off the kiss. Now I do. He gave her a half smile. Come on, he continued, releasing her and wrapping her hand in his. You have to try one of the rocks. She laughed as they walked together and crossed the stream. She perched on a medium-sized rock while Jake sat on the one next to her. Show me how it's done, she said. He leaned forward and propped his elbows on his knees, then stared across the stream. That doesn't look too hard, she said, mimicking him. Jake looked at her from the corner of his eye, holding back a smile. It gets easier with practice. She didn't like the space between them, so she slid off her rock and walked toward Jake. He straightened and reached for her, pulling her on his lap. That's better, she said, looping her arms about his neck. Sydney couldn't get enough of this man. It was like his brother had become a distant memory, a boyfriend she once had. But Jake was real. Not her past, but her present. Jake's arms settled about her waist, and they gazed at the stream and meadow together. Sydney leaned her head against his shoulder and closed her eyes for a few moments. Is it allowed to ask what you're thinking about? Jake chuckled, his chest vibrating against her. No. Sydney heaved a sigh and relaxed further into him, then started to trail her fingers along his neck, then up into his hair. Please? She whispered. He smiled but didn't say anything. His cell phone buzzed, and they both ignored it. When it rang, Sydney drew away. Maybe it's your parents looking for us. Jake shifted and pulled his phone out of his pocket. Damn. Sydney's eyes widened as she saw Ryan's name glowing on the screen. She moved off Jake's lap to give him space while he answered the phone. Where the hell's all my stuff? Ryan's voice came through the phone, loud enough for Sydney to hear. What are you talking about? Jake asked. I'm at my condo and found some guy changing out the locks. Ryan said, his voice hard and angry. The manager told me you packed up all my stuff and took it. Jake stared past Sydney as if he couldn't quite believe the conversation. I stored it in a storage unit. What are you doing back, Ryan? You come to face the charges like a man? Ryan laughed. I've come to give my stuff. Found a job in Canada. As soon as I talk to Sydney, we'll be out of here. She hates her job anyway. Sydney, Jake said, his face paling as his eyes connected with hers. Sydney felt as if a rock had slammed into her stomach. I'm coming back to Santa Rosa, Jake said. Don't leave before I get there. You know I can't promise you that, man, Ryan said. Sydney's with me, Jake said. What? Ryan sputtered. What is... I'm on my way, Jake said, then hung up the phone. Without looking at Sydney, he slid the phone into his pocket. I guess you have a decision to make. Sydney stared at him. What do you mean? He shrugged, still not looking at her. My brother wants you back, apparently. Wants you to move to Canada with him. Are you going? Sydney's face and chest heated with indignation. Do you think I'd go back to Ryan after... She couldn't even put it into words, she was so angry. Jake shoved his hands into his pockets and looked at her. His eyes were dark, his face a mask of stone. Tears burned in her eyes. She and Jake had just been kissing, and she thought they were totally in sync. Apparently, he thought she was about as flaky as his brother. Jake moved away without waiting for her to collect her thoughts. She watched him cross the stream and gather up the horses. Sydney was too stunned to think straight, both with Ryan's return and with Jake's apparent dismissal of her. She crossed the stream and mounted her horse without waiting for Jake to help her. She urged her horse forward and started to cross the meadow. Jake had caught up with her in seconds, but said nothing. Sydney knew if she tried to say anything, defend herself, or argue, she'd cry, so she kept her emotions in check and blinked back any tears that threatened. 10. The drive back to Santa Rosa was silent. Sydney wiped at her cheeks a time or two, but avoided sniffling. If anything, seeing Ryan again would give her closure, and she wanted the opportunity to give him a piece of her mind. Jake was an entirely different story. So they'd flirted a lot and kissed a lot, but really she'd only known him for a few days. They had no real history, just a lot of chemistry. From the corner of her eye, she could see that he was totally focused on the road and that his jaws seemed to be locked tight. After they'd put the horses away in the barn, she'd walked to the truck and climbed in. Her overnight bag was still in there. He'd gone inside the house to talk to his parents, or at least she assumed that was what he'd done. When he'd climbed into the truck, he'd glanced over at her, and for a moment she thought he might say something, but instead he'd started the truck and begun driving. Now, as they pulled into the parking lot of Ryan's condo complex, Sydney's stomach knotted as she saw Ryan's car in his usual reserved spot. The last time she'd seen his vehicle was before she found out all his secrets. Jake parked the truck and shut off the engine. Sydney popped open her door before he could say anything, not that she was expecting him to speak anyway. They hadn't talked for the past hour. Rian must have been watching out the window because his door opened before she reached the landing. Rian looked like hell. His eyes had dark circles as if he hadn't slept for days, and his usual sexy scruff was overgrown. His clothing looked as if he hadn't showered or changed in days, which he probably hadn't. Rian folded his arms, staring at Sydney, and then his gaze reverted to Jake, who was coming up the stairs. "What's going on?" he said, not to anyone in particular. Then his blue eyes went to Sydney's. "Why are you with my brother?" "Oh, I didn't know you had a brother," Sydney said, continuing toward him. Over an hour of stewing in the car had her pretty pissed off, and the accusation in Ryan's gaze was pushing her over the edge. "I didn't know you had parents either, and grew up an hour from here on a ranch." Rian dropped his arms to his side and took a step back into his condo. Sydney kept walking. "And I didn't know you were married before, multiple times." Ryan's gaze narrowed. "Sounds like you've been doing some investigating." "No investigating necessary," she shot back, stepping into the condo. "Jake was very helpful." "I can see that," Rian said in a harsh tone. "Jake has always been more than helpful." Jake came inside the condo and shut the door. Then he turned to Sydney and grasped her arm. "Let me talk to him," he said in a low voice. Sydney tugged out of his grasp. "I'm not finished," she said without looking at Jake. She was equally mad at him. "You're cozy," Rian said, his gaze darting between the two of them. "Looks like you weren't too upset with my leaving after all," he added. Sydney took another step toward Rian and shoved him in the chest. Ryan's eyes bulged as he nearly stumbled from the unexpected force. "What I do is no longer any of your business," Sydney said, her face heating and her voice trembling. "Our engagement ended when you decided to steal from your boss. Maybe it never really started. If I had known half of what you've done, I would have never even gone on a date with you." Ryan's face twisted into a cocky smile. "Come on, I'm not all that bad. You can't believe everything Jake says. Besides, you told me you were always drawn to bad boys, that you were tired of always being the perfect one out of your friends. You don't think someone who looks like me would have a squeaky clean history, do you?" "You're a fraud, Rian," she said. He shrugged and chuckled. "It depends on who you believe. There are always two sides to the story." His gaze moved down the length of her body. "Let's get out of here. Forget my brother and whatever he told you. Things were good between us, and I've got a killer job in Canada. You won't even have to work." Sydney stepped back. "You're kidding, right?" "No." Rian moved closer. "I don't even know you anymore," Sydney said, holding up her hand. She looked over at Jake. He'd been silent so far, but she could see that storm in his eyes. "What's going on with you two?" Rian asked, looking at Jake. "Are you in cahoots against me? Took all my stuff? Clean me out?" He narrowed his eyes at Sydney. "Found my replacement, huh? And the saintly older brother. Was he good in bed, Sydney?" Sydney opened her mouth to speak, but Jake stepped in front of her and drove his fist into the side of Ryan's jaw. Ryan stumbled back, grasping at his face and crying out, "You son of a—" Jake lunged at him, lifting Ryan off his feet and slamming him against the wall. Ryan slid to the floor with a thud. "Stop it!" Sydney yelled. The men didn't pay attention. They were full out fighting, and Sydney didn't know what to do. Call the cops? Run to the building manager? Ryan got a couple of good slugs in, but it was clear that Jake was dominating. "I'm calling the cops if you don't stop right now," Sydney said in a shaky voice. Jake raised his hands, taking a step back. Ryan shoved at him one last time, but Jake continued to move away. Both men were bleeding, and Ryan stayed on the couch, dabbing his bleeding nose with the edge of his shirt. "Let's get out of here," Jake said to Sydney, turning to her and searching her gaze as if he was still questioning her. But this wasn't the time to argue and to tell him she was still upset with him. So, with a final look at Ryan, she walked to the door and opened it. "I'll be pressing charges, brother," Ryan called out. "Go ahead," Jake said, pausing at the door, his tone steely. "Let the investigators dig up your past." Sydney wanted to get away from this place, but Ryan had parting words for her, too. "Don't let the door hit you on the way out, Sydney," he called out. Jake stiffened and turned, so Sydney grabbed his hand. "Come on, Jake." She pulled the door shut, blocking out all sight of Ryan. "You've done enough. We need to leave." Jake didn't move, but finally he looked at her, then exhaled. "Are you okay?" Sydney didn't know whether to laugh or to cry from the stress of what had happened between the two brothers. "You're the one who's bleeding." She touched the edge of his lip that had blood on it. He'd be sporting a nice black eye soon, too. The sound of a siren made her draw back. Did the neighbors call the cops? Let's not wait to find out, Jake said, tugging her with him. They hurried down the stairs, then climbed into his truck. I don't want you going back to your apartment alone until Ryan is gone for good. Do you think he'll really go to Canada? I can't say. Jake pulled out of the parking lot, then glanced over at her. I'm sorry about all of this. About what Ryan said, about fighting him, and mostly for not giving you the chance to defend yourself like I should have. It didn't matter. Not anymore. Sydney reached over and grasped his hand. He threaded their fingers together. Do you believe that I'd choose you? Yeah, he said in a gruff voice. They drove the rest of the way to her apartment in silence, holding hands, the air between them thick with all that had happened. When Jake parked, he said, Tell me what you want to do, Sydney. She met his gaze and saw much more than a single question in his eyes. Does the ranch have Wi-Fi? Only in the mornings, Jake said with a half smile. Kidding. Yeah, it's how my parents watch whichever series they're hooked on at night. Really? Sydney said, surprised. Well, I could probably work remotely for a couple of days if I had to. She looked out the front window. If Ryan doesn't leave tonight. Jake tightened his grip on her. Want to grab some more of your stuff? All right, Sydney said. The thought of staying in her place, even if Jake was with her, and having Ryan show up, made her nervous. She didn't want the two brothers fighting again. Let's go in and get you some ice, and then I'll grab a few more things. Jake followed her into her apartment, and it was strange to see it now, with him at her side. She saw it through his eyes, and she noticed how yellow everything was. Yellow throw pillow, yellow accent rug, yellow vases, yellow tablecloth in the kitchen. You like yellow, huh? Jake asked. She laughed, grabbing some ice and putting it into a zip-top baggie. I guess. What about you? She pressed the bag of ice on the side of his head. He said, capturing her hand and pulling her against him. His arms slid around her waist, trapping her into place. I don't mind it. She blinked up at him as her heart thumped. She hadn't forgotten one moment of his kisses or his touches. Good, she whispered as she lifted up on her toes and gently kissed his cheek. I'm not that injured, Jake whispered back, moving his mouth to hers and kissing her. Did I tell you thanks for choosing me? Sydney drew back slightly to gaze into his eyes. You did not. His eyes seemed to bore into her, and he said, Thank you. He kissed the edge of her mouth. Thank you. Then he kissed her neck, sending a riot of shivers through her. Thank you. Sydney said, her breath rushing out. I like your thank yous. He smiled against her skin. Then he straightened. We should get going before Ryan gets any ideas. While you get your stuff ready, I'll talk to the apartment manager about keeping watch on your place for a few days. Sydney reluctantly released him. All right, I'll hurry. Once in her room, she closed her eyes and exhaled. So much had happened in such a short time. Her mind was spinning, but her heart was full. She'd had her phone on silent, and she checked it to find a missed message from her mother and several texts from Maria and June. Sydney sat on her bed for a moment and texted her mom, then replied to Maria and June. Ryan's back, and he and Jake got into a fight. I'm going back to the ranch with Jake for a few days to let things settle with Ryan. Says he's going to Canada for a job. Replies tumbled in on top of each other. Wow, what kind of fight? You're going back to the ranch with Jake? Really? What's going on with him? Have you kissed him yet? Sydney laughed at the last one. If only her friends knew, which they wouldn't, at least not yet. Never kiss and tell, she wrote, following up with several winking emojis. Then she pocketed her phone as she heard Jake come inside the apartment and call for her. Coming, she said, grabbing the bag she'd added a couple of outfits to. When she walked into the living room, she stopped short. Jake was standing there with the apartment manager, Randy Brown. Hi, Sydney, Randy said. This guy told me that you're worried about your ex showing up. and possibly trying to get into your apartment?" he said, indicating Jake. Sydney nodded. "He might still have the key." "I'll keep an eye out on the place and on your car," he said. "Thanks, I appreciate it," Sydney said. Jake moved to take the bag from her hands. "Is that everything?" he asked. "Yeah," she told him. Then to the manager, she said, "Please call my cell if there's anything I need to know about." "Will do," the manager said. "I'll be putting a lockbox on the door so we can't get in, unless he breaks a window or something." "I appreciate that," Sydney said. They all walked out of the apartment, and Sydney locked her door. She and Jake said goodbye to the manager, then climbed into Jake's truck. Sydney felt exhausted, and she leaned back against the seat, closing her eyes. "Do you want to grab something to eat?" Jake asked, starting the truck. "Only if you want to," Sydney said. "I want to put some distance between me and Rian." Jake reached over and grabbed her hand. "Let's get out of here, then." 11. Sydney fell into a deep sleep that night. When she awoke around 2 a.m., she was surprised she'd even slept. Although exhausted, she was also wired from so many changes and emotions happening over the past few days. That and the fact that Jake's room was only 2 doors away. He'd kissed her before sending her off to bed, and she'd seen the longing in his eyes, matching her own. But he was also putting her first, which she appreciated. But now, lying alone in the guest bedroom, in the dark, she didn't want to be alone. She wanted Jake's arms around her, holding her, and him telling her that Ryan was in the far, distant past and that the future would work out. That they would work out. Was it possible, she wondered, to become so attached to a man in such a short period of time? On the drive back to the ranch, Jake had been quiet again, but this time they were connected, holding hands. She'd continued to hold his hand when Jake spoke with his parents and told them the latest developments. Sydney had received hugs from both parents, and still, she wished she could do more and bring them more comfort. A deep voice rumbled from the hallway, and Sydney stilled. Someone was talking in the middle of the night. She rose from her bed and crossed the bedroom, then cracked open her door to listen. It sounded like Jake was talking in his bedroom. Was he on the phone? Sydney walked down the hall and stopped outside his bedroom door. She froze when she heard Jake say, "You called the wrong person, Ryan." Ryan had called Jake? Now what was going on? She couldn't stand waiting, so she opened the door and stepped into Jake's bedroom. He was sitting on the edge of his bed and looked up with surprise when she entered. "I meant it when I told you that I'm done with you," Jake said. "You have to fight your own battles now, and I suggest making your next phone call to the public defender's office. They'll take your case on for free." Sydney leaned against the wall, listening as dread filled her. Had Ryan been stopped at the border or something? Had he been arrested? After a few more minutes of Jake arguing with Ryan, Jake finally hung up and turned off his phone. He leaned forward and buried his face in his hands. "What did he want?" Sydney asked, moving to sit next to him on the bed. "He was arrested in an altercation at the Seattle airport," Jake said. "Apparently his driver's license was flagged, and he wasn't too happy about it." "So he's in jail?" Jake lifted his head to look at Sydney. "Yeah. He wants bail money and needs an attorney." "You're not going to do it, are you?" Sydney asked, even though she'd heard the conversation. "I'm not," Jake said, his gray eyes on her. "I thought I'd done hard things before, but this is really hard." "It's the right thing, though," Sydney said, moving closer and wrapping her arms around his neck. "When I see you and know how he's hurt you, it's easier for me to stay on task," Jake said in a quiet voice. "But he is my brother, and he's desperate." Sydney put a hand on his cheek. "What's the worst that can happen? Be sent to a white-collar crime prison?" "Probably," Jake said. "How else will he learn his lesson?" Sydney pressed. "A couple of years in jail will teach him, and it will give you and your parents a break." "Hmm," Jake said, pulling her closer. "You're right. I know you're right. I just have to figure out how to live with my decision. I can help you with that, Sydney said, running her fingers through his hair. Jake lowered his head and buried his face in her neck. I can't believe that Ryan would give you up. His loss, my gain. My gain, too, Sydney whispered in his ear. Is this what you usually wear to bed? Jake asked. Sydney looked down at her tank shirt that left little to the imagination since she wore no bra, and the pajama bottoms that were more like flannel shorts. Only when no one can see me. I like it, Jake said, moving his mouth against her neck. Heat shot through Sydney. She was in Jake's bedroom, in the middle of the night, and he was kissing her. If things had moved fast before between them, it had just sped up. Jake, she said, I should probably go back to my room. Can I come with you? He murmured, trailing his lips along her exposed collarbone. Things are so new, and I still need to clear my head with all of the changes in my life, Sydney said. Jake released a soft moan, then lifted his head. I understand, and you're right, I like you too much to mess anything up. Thanks, Sydney said, kissing him on the mouth. That's not helping, Jake said. Sydney smiled. Sorry. You look adorable when you've just woken up. That doesn't sound very manly. In your case, it's very manly, Sydney said, reluctantly disentangling herself from his arms. Jake stood with her and walked her to her bedroom, his hand clasping hers. He stood in her doorway. Good night, he whispered as he released her hand. See you in the morning. Good night, she said, tempted to draw him into her room and lock the door behind them. But she wanted things to go right with Jake. By the way her pulse was thumping and her heart was practically reaching for him, she knew that she'd found a man she could spend a lifetime with. They still had a lot of hurdles to overcome, like his brother, and the fact that she worked an hour away, but for tonight, she'd be happy with sleeping 2 doors down from him. She began to shut the door when Jake said, Wait. She paused. He leaned against the door frame only inches from her. I want to tell you thank you. I couldn't have gotten through all of this without you, and as a bonus, there's a beautiful woman in my house who I think likes me. Sydney smiled. I'm more than like you, Jake Stevenson. Good, he said, his own smile appearing. I hope to keep it that way because I've fallen for you. Sydney felt a blush spread through her and her stomach flipped over. You're making it really hard to shut this door on you. He winked. Sweet dreams, then. I know who I'll be dreaming about. Before she could respond, he stepped away and walked back to his room. She watched him walk down the hall, and as he stepped into his bedroom, she closed her own door with a sigh. Jake Stevenson was the real deal, and Sydney didn't know what she'd done to deserve this man. But she knew one thing for certain. She was going to follow her heart this time. This has been Falling for Sydney, written by Heather B. Moore, narrated by Exie Sands. Copyright 2016-2018 by Heather B. Moore. Production copyright by Heather B. Moore, 2018.